Good day. Today, Sunday, 28th January 2024, we've been receiving further news of further Russian advances in the battlefronts in Ukraine. Now, there are reports that the Russians have captured in the Kupiansk direction a village known as Avdeyevka. There is no confirmation of this so far from the Russian Defense Ministry. Indeed, a few hours ago, there were even reports that the Russians had captured a string of other villages in this area as well. But it does seem that the Russians are back on the advance in Kupiansk, pushing towards the Oskol River, and apparently they've re-entered Sinkovka and are also attempting to attack Sinkovka itself and to capture that hotly contested village. There are also reports that the Russian Air Force was busy last night bombing Kupiansk itself heavily and other Ukrainian positions near and around Kupiansk. Lastly, there are stories that the Ukrainians themselves, apparently increasingly alarmed about the situation around Kupiansk, are building fortifications inside the town itself and are redeploying troops from other areas to try to hold positions in Kupiansk. So it could be that the battle around Kupiansk is going to intensify at some point over the next few days or weeks. Let me say again, there's been no confirmation of any of this from the Russian Defense Ministry, just as they provided no information at all in their official bulletins about the fighting in Avdeyevka. They provided no information about the fighting in Kupiansk, except that one Russian military official, Sergei Zybinsky, who is the spokesman of Russian Battle Group West, has made this comment. The battle group's motorized rifle units, acting in cooperation with artillery, repelled 2 attacks and 3 counterattacks by assault groups from the Ukrainian 32nd Mechanized Brigade and 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade in the areas of Sinkovka and Terny. All attacks and counterattacks were repulsed. The enemy was forced to withdraw in the southern and western directions. And TASS tells us that Zybinsky confirmed that the battle group's heavy flamethrower systems inflicted 3 strikes on strong points of platoons from the Ukrainian 60th Mechanized Brigade in the area of Avdeyevka in Kharkiv region. The enemy's losses in the Kupiansk area were up to 25 servicemen, 2 armored fighting vehicles, and 3 pickup trucks. So, notice here the use of the words 2 attacks and 3 counterattacks. 3 counterattacks must imply, 3 Ukrainian counterattacks must imply that there were preceding Russian attacks and that the Russians are advancing. And we're told that these attacks and counterattacks took place in the areas of Sinkovka and Terny, and that all of these attacks and counterattacks were repulsed, and that the Ukrainians were forced to withdraw. And we are also told that the terrifying TOS-1 flamethrower tanks, the essentially multiple launch rocket systems, which launch incredibly powerful thermobaric munitions against enemy defenses. Anyway, that these have been active and that they have been used in the area of Avdeyevka in Kharkiv region, which is the only hint the Russian Defense Ministry is giving us that there is fighting going on in the area of Avdeyevka, a village which, as I've said, some reports are saying the Russians have already captured. I saw one report on Slavyangrad which said that Avdeyevka has been liberated from the Ukrainian forces, that the Ukrainians have been forced to withdraw from this village, but that the Russian soldiers have not actually occupied it, though small parties of Russian troops have occasionally entered it. And the explanation given is that Avdeyevka is on low ground, and sending troops into Avdeyevka at this time would expose them to Ukrainian shelling and presumably FPV drone attacks. So anyway, it does look as if something is happening on the Kupiansk front. But whatever it is, for the moment, bear in mind that the fighting is not of the level of intensity that we're seeing in other places. It's not hundreds of soldiers being killed or wounded, as we regularly see happen in Bakhmut and perhaps also in Avdeyevka, though the Russian Defense Ministry has provided us with, as I said, no updates about the situation in Avdeyevka and has been stonily silent about the situation there for several weeks now. But in Kupiansk area, in contrast to what we read and hear about hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers being killed or wounded from the Russians, in the Kupiansk area, according to Zabinski, enemy losses were up to 25 servicemen, which in relation to the sort of losses we are used to seeing on these battlefronts, suggests that so far the fighting is at a relatively low level of intensity. Now, that may change over the next few hours. We will have to wait and see, and obviously I will be providing further updates in further programs. There are also reports of heavy fighting going on in other places, specifically in Bakhmut. Again, heavy fighting for Bogdanovka, this village to the northwest of Bakhmut. And I mentioned yesterday in my program that the Russians appear to have advanced and captured some buildings in Ivanivska, Krasnoye, as the Russians refer to it as, this village to the southwest of Bakhmut, which the Wagner organization never captured, or indeed even seriously attacked. But the Russians now do seem to be working towards actually trying to capture this village. And as I've said, if Bogdanovka and Ivanivska are indeed captured by the Russians, then the Battle of Bakhmut will have come to an end. The Russians will be able to advance all the way to the canal, the Chasiv Yar Canal. Beyond it lies Chasiv Yar itself. We will see whether they choose to stop at the canal or whether they intend to advance beyond the canal and capture Chasiv Yar itself, as I believe many people expect. We shall just see. And there's been lots of reports of fighting and advances by the Russians in other places. There's reports that the Russians have made further progress advancing in the Liman area, that they're getting very close now to the Zherebets River, and they might indeed be in the process of occupying certain villages on the Zherebets River. Again, the reports are fairly strong, but not absolutely reliable. We shall have to wait and see, again, what exactly is taking place there. But it does seem as if the Russians are on the attack in that area. And there are also reports that the Russians are advancing and putting pressure on the Ukrainians around Marinka, pushing hard towards two villages, or through one village, which is Georgievka, towards Kurachovo, and Pabieda, which is slightly to the southwest of Marinka itself. Anyway, lots of fighting going on in many different places. There's also, intriguingly, more and more information that a new battle for Rabotino is underway. Only this time, it is the Russians who are on the attack, trying to clear Ukrainian troops from this village, Rabotino, which was the center of all those frenetic Ukrainian attempts to capture it over the course of the summer. It's a village, I remember, which the Ukrainians expected when they launched their offensive in the summer that they would capture on the first day. It took them roughly 2.5 months to actually break into Rabotino itself. My sense is that they never fully consolidated control of it. The Russians were pushed out, but the Ukrainians, I think, always found that keeping large numbers of troops in Rabotino put them in a difficult position, exposed the troops to Ukrainian troops, to heavy Russian artillery and drone attack. They preferred, as I remember, to advance deeper towards the Surovikin line defenses in the area southwest of Rabotino. And they did, in fact, advance in that area and did eventually reach some of the outlying fortifications of the Surovikin line, but they never penetrated it. Now, I'm assuming that if the Russians recapture Rabotino and reestablish full control of this village, then that will make the position of the remaining Ukrainian troops in this area between Rabotino and Verbovoye, the area which bloggers on each side refer to as Bradley Square, because so many Bradleys were burnt up there during the Ukrainian summer offensive. Well, I'm assuming that if the Russians do capture Rabotino, which will bring control of all the high ground in the area around the square back under Russian hands, then the Ukrainians will be obliged to withdraw from whatever part of Bradley Square they continue to occupy and control and fall back towards Orekhovo. And it seems that the Ukrainians are preparing for that possibility because there are multiple reports that they're building fortifications and digging trenches around Orekhovo, suggesting that they are indeed intending to retreat there, in which case all the territorial gains that the Ukrainians achieved during the summer offensive will have been negated. Now, I would just quickly finish this discussion about Rabotino by saying that if the Russians do indeed recapture Rabotino, one should not expect that it will become the great fortified, or rather the heavily fortified position that it became for the Russians in advance of the summer offensive. One of the things that made Rabotino so difficult for the Ukrainians to capture, as we who followed the Ukraine's summer offensive remember very well, was that the Russians not only established strong positions on the heights in Rabotino, but they were able to lay all these dense minefields around it. And there's all those vivid pictures of Ukrainian tanks and armored vehicles, Leopard 2s and Bradleys burning in those minefields, which the Ukrainians found impossible to clear as they tried to advance towards the Russian positions. Now, I am assuming that in the many months that the Russians have occupied, the Ukrainians have occupied most of this territory, they will have cleared those minefields. I cannot really see the Russians reseeding these minefields all over again, given that they now have the initiative in the war. Why would they bother to do that? And I can even imagine that doing that would cause complications for their own offensives in this area if they plan any. All that it would mean if Rabotino is recaptured and brought fully under Russian control is that Ukraine's offensive had not only been defeated, but that whatever ephemeral territory the Ukrainians gained as a result of it would have been lost, so that all that enormous sacrifice of men and machines that Ukraine and the Western powers invested in the summer offensive would have been literally for nothing. Anyway, just saying all of that. Now, there is a lot of intriguing information coming from two other battlefronts, which is not entirely easy to, again, make much sense of. The Ukrainians have been talking about creating major fortified barriers and minefields along their northern border, and it's likely that they have laid some minefields, and they do appear to have established some fortifications along their northern border in the areas of Chernihiv and Sumy, especially, which were, of course, areas where the Russians penetrated deep into Ukrainian territory in the early weeks of the special military operation in February and March 2022. However, there are conflicting reports about this territory. On the one hand, it does seem that the Russians are regularly now launching cross-border raids with, one must assume, special forces striking at Ukrainian defense positions, border posts, that kind of thing, along this front line. And it also seems that the Russian artillery in this area is extremely busy and that it regularly attacks Ukrainian positions south of the border. So far, however, we have seen no evidence of the Russians launching any concerted attack here, and the Ukrainians, for their part, appear to have decided that there is no immediate risk of a Russian offensive in this area because, as I discussed in my program yesterday, they are redeploying troops tasked with defending this border to try to plug the holes in Kupiansk and Avdeyevka, much to the dissatisfaction of the Ukrainian soldiers involved. But the fact that the Russians are regularly launching artillery strikes and conducting cross-border raids here, and the fact that they are conducting apparently regular bombing with their Sukhoi 34s and their precision-guided bombs in this area, well, that might suggest that the Russians do have some grander plan. A couple of days ago, there were reports that the Russians had actually captured a village in this area. It turned out that that was not the case. Anyway, we will see. Again, I saw that a Ukrainian official had spoken about the likelihood that at some point in the summer, with Ukrainian forces severely overstretched and with reserves burnt up, the Russians will launch a big offensive somewhere. And that might indeed be the case, and it could be in the north. Many people appear to expect so. But the Russian General Staff, as I've said on many occasions, keeps its secrets, and none of us can really say. My guess is that they haven't yet fully finalized their plans. It might be in this area or it might be somewhere else. It could be that the Russians intend to attack in every conceivable direction and then launch a big attack in one. Who knows? But one way or the other, what these attacks do along the northern border is that they keep the Ukrainians guessing, and I suspect that's partly the purpose of the Russians in launching these attacks. Anyway, I mention all of this because this is clearly an area to keep an eye on, which of course many people are doing, including people in Ukraine. And last but not least, there has been a major Russian bombing offensive on Ukrainian positions in the islands of the Dnieper and on the west bank of Kherson region. Now, there's been much debate and discussion about why this is the case. It's been suggested that the Russians are taking steps to preempt another Ukrainian attempt to try to establish a bridgehead on the east bank of the Dnieper. And perhaps that is what it is. Perhaps that is what this is all about. But I remember that Vladimir Saldo, who is the governor of the Russian-controlled part of Kherson region, he has said on several occasions that the Russians have a plan to recapture Kherson region east of the Dnieper, including presumably the city of Kherson itself. Now, as I said, I am not going to try to second guess what the Russian General Staff will do, but I will make a simple observation. We have a fair amount of knowledge, or rather, we are provided with a fair amount of knowledge about Ukrainian military dispositions. The various bloggers and commentators and reporters provide us with a fair amount of information about where the main Ukrainian military units are located. We get that same kind of information from time to time about the Russian forces, though this tends to come from Western sources rather than Ukrainians. But I, for one, have always found it very difficult to get a complete sense of where the Russians are locating most of their army at any particular point in time. And it could be that the Russians are indeed gathering up forces and are positioning themselves perhaps for some kind of advance along the Dnieper or some big operation in this area. There are problems and issues. It would mean the Russians advancing into a Kherson region, despite the Dnieper River again being in the way. They previously withdrew from this territory because it was considered militarily vulnerable. So why would they want to go back? Again, I don't know, but I wonder whether, in part at least, the Russian strategy is to keep the Ukrainians guessing, even as they continue to knock out Ukrainian artillery positions and cause severe devastation to Ukrainian troops located in this area west of the Dnieper. Now, all that I've discussed, the fighting in Kupiansk is definitely important and interesting, but as I said, it is of a relatively low level of intensity, lower in intensity than the fighting in Bakhmut. But the main fighting appears to be taking place or continuing to take place in Avdeyevka. And there's been lots of reports about the situation there. Now, the general consensus of the reports appears to be that the Russians are still in control of large areas of southern Avdeyevka. This is despite the fact that if one looks at the maps, they appear to have pushed some of their troops some distance up two roads on the southwestern edge of Avdeyevka, and that might have put those troops in a rather vulnerable position. Again, I'm not a military person. I'm not saying. There appear to have been intense Ukrainian attacks taking place precisely in the area of this salient which the Russian troops are holding. But even as the fighting in this area of Avdeyevka is intense, the Russians have been cleaning up all the Ukrainian strongholds to the south of Avdeyevka, the area of the Tsar's hunting lodge, the area of the air defense base, probably another area called Cherubasha, presumably after a cartoon character, a Soviet cartoon character. I'm not able to say exactly what this particular fortified position it is and what purposes it is. It looks like a rather complex road facility from the graphics that I've seen of it, but I've never seen any photographs. Anyway, I wonder whether the Russian objective here is rather to keep the Ukrainians busy in this area of these two roads whilst they clean up these fortifications to the south of Avdeyevka and consolidate control of certain cities and urban blocks in Avdeyevka itself, at which point, when all that is completed, well, they might decide to advance, but conceivably, I can imagine them, given that conservation of force has always been the Russian strategy, to pull back some of their more outlying troops and to consolidate a few blocks further south. Just saying. I mention this because if we get information that the Ukrainians have recaptured part of Avdeyevka and have driven the Russians back, I would like to get in advance an explanation of why I think that has happened. I doubt that the Russians actually are planning just to hold on to two blocks, a number of blocks along two main roads indefinitely. Either they intend to advance, these are a spring point for a further advance, or they're intending to consolidate their gains and eventually to retreat in preparation for the further advance. That at least seems to me logical. Anyway, and it is, by the way, consistent, I should say, with some advice I've been given by a number of better informed and better understanding people about this kind of thing than me. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this. But it does look that elsewhere in Avdeyevka, the Russians are indeed very much on the move. And there are lots of reports, and they appear to be accurate, that the Russians have now captured a significant further part of this rather large village of Pervomaisky to the southwest of Avdeyevka. Again, Russian commentators and bloggers and all of these kind of people suggest that if Pervomaisky is brought fully under Russian control, then that will position the Russians to advance towards various other Ukrainian fortified positions and gradually to collapse Ukrainian defense lines to the west of Avdeyevka, which would, of course, oblige the Ukrainians in that case to pull back and abandon Avdeyevka entirely. Anyway, it's an interesting battle, and it's been a long and bitterly fought one. Again, one senses that the Ukrainians have made intense efforts to try to control this village, but it's clear to me that the Russians incrementally are continuing to push the Ukrainians back. And the most interesting news, perhaps, is coming from the northwest of Avdeyevka. Now, the Russians do appear to have control of at least a part perhaps most of Stepovoye, this village to the northwest of Avdeyevka that has been so bitterly fought over for so long. And I've suggested that, in part, Russian attacks in this area of Stepovoye were a pinning operation to prevent the Ukrainians redeploying more troops to hold back the very carefully planned Russian attack in southern Avdeyevka, an attack that the Russians clearly planned and prepared for over quite a long time. A complex operation, which, as I said, is not done on the fly. Now, there are now satellite photos which show the utter devastation of the village to the west of Stepovoye, which is Berdichi, the concentrations of Russian artillery strikes on Berdichi, and of bombing, presumably, suggests that whatever Ukrainian troops are located in Berdichi have been having a very, very hard time over the last few weeks. And again, I suggest that this is consistent with the Russian policy of aggressive attrition. The Russians push into Stepovoye, they capture at least part of Stepovoye, they advance their forces along the railway line towards ODYSEE, this village further to the north. The Ukrainians are obliged to commit more and more of their troops to try to hold their positions in this area, because losing them would enable the Russians to close the sack and to trap the Ukrainian forces defending Avdeyevka in a cauldron. And they have to deploy the Ukrainians, their troops, in the place where there is at least some cover, which is Berdichi, and that, of course, makes it possible for the Russians to shell and bomb these troops in Berdichi. As I said, causing these troops a lot of, giving these troops a very hard time and escalating their casualties. Well, that's interesting, and it's consistent with what we already know, but latest reports showing battles, and this comes from the Ukrainian side, showing battles between advancing Russian and Ukrainian troops somewhat to the east, towards the settlement known as Keramik, which is basically north of Krasnogorovka, show Russian forces advancing where they were not expected. And it seems that the Russians, at some point over the last couple of days or maybe weeks, have gained control of a substantial amount of territory as they push forward towards Keramik, and that the Russians have been conducting very, very heavy shelling and bombing in this area. We know about the Russian advances because the Ukrainians have shown us a video, as I said, of the Russian troops in this area. And we know about the incredibly heavy Russian bombing and shelling because we have satellite photos of this. Now, there are a number of possible explanations of this. It could be that the Russians are actually intending to capture Keramik. As Dima at the military summary channel pointed out, if the Russians do that, then any Ukrainian hopes of counterattacking and recapturing Krasnogorovka are effectively buried. Now, it could be that that is what the Russians are planning to do. In other words, preempt a Ukrainian attempt to capture Krasnogorovka. Or it could be that the Russians are simply stretching Ukrainian defenses. And it could be that this rush of further Ukrainian reinforcements to this area is not so much intended to capture Krasnogorovka as to withstand these Russian advances towards Keramik. Again, we have various possibilities, and without knowing the plans of the two general staffs and of their local commanders, it is impossible to say what the intentions of either side is. Anyway, that's a brief, fairly brief overview of the situation on the battle lines. Intense fighting going on, the Russians pushing forward everywhere, the Ukrainians undoubtedly suffering significant losses, the Russians gaining apparently significant ground around Kupiansk, though, as I've said, the fighting here is perhaps not as intense as it is in some places. But nonetheless, causing the Ukrainians to feel increasingly worried about their ability to hold Kupiansk itself, and the Russians making significant moves towards Avdeyevka, consolidating control in the south of Avdeyevka, clearing up the Ukrainian fortified positions there, and gradually tightening the ring around Avdeyevka that they seem to be in the process of creating. So, a lot going on the battlefronts, not always easy to understand and read it, but clearly, as I said, a major battle underway. Now, we've had a cascade of reports in the United States about a new battle strategy being planned by the United States for Ukraine. It's very interesting how the Americans believe that it's their right to tell the Ukrainians how to conduct their war. But anyway, I put that aside for the moment. It does show maybe how independent of the United States, or not independent rather, of the United States, Ukraine actually is. But anyway, we are told that the latest plan, and this is all I think from the Washington Post, is that Ukraine go completely over to the defensive, that it give up any idea of trying to capture territory in this year, which is to say 2024, that it revert entirely to the defensive. We're told that it's acknowledged that there will sometimes be Russian gains and Ukrainian gains, that this isn't talk about a completely static battlefield, but that the United States, on balance, rather not on balance, has decided that further grandiose offensives, such as the one we saw in the summer, and the one which appears to have been attempted in Kherson region, with the bridgehead in Krinky, are a bad idea and should be abandoned. Now, what the Ukrainians make of all of this is, of course, another question. I suspect that people like Zelensky will not like this plan at all. It means Ukraine permanently on the defensive. Ukraine still hasn't signed off on its mobilization law. I've already made clear my own strong feelings that mass conscription in Ukraine of the men who are still remaining is a disastrous idea, and that Ukraine should initiate talks. But of course, Ukraine is doing neither of these things at the moment. It is not seeking talks with the Russians, and it is not conscripting the men either. It's in a kind of limbo, even as its army bleeds to death on the battlefields. It's not reinforcing that army with a new conscription, and it's not seeking to end the war by initiating negotiations either. But anyway, what the Ukrainians think about all of this, what they think about these proposals, I don't know. But the fact is that the reality is that if Ukraine does decide to go on the defensive, then the strategic initiative will have been passed conclusively over to the Russians. And from a Ukrainian point of view, that might not be a welcome prospect, given that, as I've discussed in program after program, all the evidence is that the Russians are getting stronger and stronger, and the Ukrainians are getting weaker and weaker. Now, we've had a lot more information about the last point, about the Ukrainians getting weaker. We've had a long article in Business Insider. I'm not going to take time to read it, but it admits again Ukraine's increasing shell hunger. There's lots of things in the article, lots of comments in the article about how Western governments are trying to increase supplies of shells to Ukraine, and an order that NATO has made, 1.4 billion euro order for fresh shells, 225,000 155 millimeter shells, to be precise. Now, as to the last, it's not clear whether this is intended for Ukraine at all, or rather for NATO's own use. But this again gives us a sense of how hopeless this ammunition war has now become, even as Russian production of shells is in the millions. NATO is having to spend huge amounts of money to buy, well, less than 250,000 shells. And in terms of Ukrainian usage of shells in the war, that is nowhere near enough. And in fact, Business Insider article, if you read it through, you have lots of comments and statements about the need for the collective West to increase production of shells, and a lot of criticism, again, of the Republicans for holding up funding, which supposedly is compounding Ukraine's crisis and inability to have enough shells. But no real plan in this article, no real explanation about how production of shells is actually going to be increased. And, you know, one hears all sorts of stories and reports from time to time about how the West is trying to buy shells from South Korea. South Korea, by the way, appears to have now told the Russians that they're not going to be supplying any more shells for use in the Ukraine war. The latest report I've heard about South Korea is that the South Koreans have informed the Russians that they're not going to provide any weapons at all to Ukraine, and have never done so. Of course, we know the last is not true. They gave 500,000 shells to the United States last year, which then, as I said at the time, immediately transferred those shells to the Ukrainians. So it was a third-party staging there. But the South Koreans apparently have searched out the Russians and have told them that South Korea will not provide weapons to Ukraine. At the same time, the South Koreans have made it clear that they're very concerned about the burgeoning relationship between Russia and North Korea, and that this is having an effect on relations between South Korea and Russia. Now, this is all interesting, and in fact, it might be a little more ambiguous than it sounds, because you could say that this was a threat, that the South Koreans are saying, look, we haven't provided any weapons up to now, but we're not happy with what you're doing, supplying, getting so close to the North Koreans. And if you go on doing that, well, our relations will suffer, and we might change our policy, and we might start providing shells to the Ukrainians. That's one interpretation. But another interpretation, one which I rather favor, by the way, is that the South Koreans are telling the Russians, look, We're very worried about your increasing relationship with the North Koreans. Don't do that. It will really crash our relations, which we value. And in return, you have our promise that we are not going to supply more weapons to the North, to the Ukrainians, as we did last year. Given that given that South Korea did, in fact, as I said, supply shells to Ukraine last year, despite the current denials, I favor the second interpretation. And I think that is the one the Russians probably understand the South Koreans to mean. But anyway, that's a long aside. The fact is, there is no real plan to increase shell production in the collective West. There have been attempts to find shells in other places like Pakistan and South Korea, and one senses that that is now essentially exhausted. And claims about huge increases in shell production in the United States, according to the latest reports, have turned out to be wrong, as I rather assumed. So there really is no prospect, no possibility of increasing shell production, or rather increasing shell deliveries to Ukraine. And that really brings us back to the arguments that are going on about appropriations for Ukraine in Congress. Because it is quite clear to me that this issue of appropriations is simply an alibi that the Biden administration is hiding behind to disguise the fact that they have no shells. They don't have the shells to give to Ukraine. Rather than straightforwardly admit that, rather than straightforwardly admit that getting production of shells up to the levels needed to re-equip Ukraine will take too many years, by which time the war will be over and the Russians will have won. What the administration is doing is saying, well, look, it's not our fault, it's the fault of the Republicans because they are not providing the funding that would enable us to provide Ukraine with the weapons, including the shells that Ukraine needs in order to fight and win the war. And the same is true about this latest plan, if it is even a plan, to get Ukraine to go on the defensive and to give up the idea of attacking along the front lines. It's not really a plan at all. It's certainly not a plan to win the war. The administration surely knows, at least at some level, about how lopsided the battle in Ukraine is at the present time. The fact that the Russians are getting stronger by the day and the Ukrainians are getting weaker by the day. Rather, it is an attempt to put off the moment of Ukraine's eventual collapse so that it doesn't happen before the November election, to keep the war going for a further 10 months so that President Biden can be re-elected in what is now expected to be a bitterly fought election with Donald Trump to avert that collapse over the next 10 months so as not to have another foreign policy debacle as the election comes into sight. And how do you do that? Well, you try to persuade the Ukrainians to do that which they have consistently failed to do up to this point, which is to conserve their forces and to try to hold off the Russians for as long as possible, so as to avoid running out of weapons and men too quickly, the last of which would, of course, happen if Ukraine were to continue attacking, and which would just accelerate Ukraine's collapse. So, as I said, I don't think these are plans. I don't think this is really a plan. Brian Beletic has taken it apart in his latest video, which is an interesting and good video. But anyway, I don't think it's a real plan, at least not a real plan in terms of US objectives in the war, just as I don't really believe this appropriations battle in Congress is really about funding Ukraine at all. As Brian Boletic himself has said, you can't produce weapons if the capacity to do so is not there, however much money you have, and you can't buy weapons, including shells, which don't exist. All you're going to do if you throw money at a problem is increase the unit cost for shells, which is exactly what we're seeing happen. So anyway, that's again something of a long aside. The situation, as I said, on the battlefronts continues to deteriorate for Ukraine. We're probably going to have, in a few weeks' time, a quieter period during the Rasputitsa, but there's no doubt at all which side is going to emerge even stronger following the end of the Rasputitsa. It'll be the Russians, and it will be the Russians who will hold the strategic initiative, not just this year, but in my opinion, right up until the moment when the war itself ends. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the situation on the battlefronts. Now, one particular person has been very busy over the last couple of days, as I've said already, and that is Vladimir Putin. He has visited Kaliningrad, and he's been to St. Petersburg, and he also visited, along with Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, who is now clearly a firm ally, and whatever tensions once existed between Putin and Lukashenko, it's clear that these are now history. Anyway, they visited a new memorial that has been constructed in Russia near St. Petersburg to commemorate not just the million or so people who died in the siege of Leningrad. As somebody who's been to St. Petersburg, I should say that the effects of that siege on this city are very, very palpable right up to this day. But anyway, it's not, this new monument is not just to commemorate those who died in Leningrad. It's also intended to, it's also intended as a memorial to civilian citizens of the Soviet Union, who, as the Russian presidential website puts it, fell victim of the Nazi genocide during the Great Patriotic War, in other words, during the Second World War. And the Russian presidential website says that the event is timed to the 80th anniversary of the breaking of the siege of Leningrad. The siege of Leningrad is one of the most harrowing events of the Second World War. The city was besieged for, well, for 2 years. It was very difficult to get food into the city. The humanitarian situation became catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions of people, died of hunger in St. Petersburg, Leningrad, as of course it was at that time. And as Putin pointed out, in certain comments which he made whilst attending this memorial, a city, Leningrad, which before the war had a population of 3 million, came out of the war with a population of just 800,000. Though it should be said, of course, that some of that reduction, a significant part of it, in fact, was caused by evacuations. Now, I mention all of this because it is not a coincidence that Putin is attending all these ceremonies and all these celebrations, if that is the right word, of these events in the siege of Leningrad, the ending of the siege of Leningrad at this particular time. Obviously, he has this election coming in March, and as I said, these are to a great extent campaign events, though there is no doubt about Putin's own strong personal feelings about these issues, which are, of course, ones that are shared by the overwhelming majority of Russians. But the careful use of the word genocide in describing what the Nazis did in the Soviet Union during the Second World War, which, note, extends beyond the events of the Holocaust, the intentional extermination of the Jewish people of Europe. Anyway, all of that is intended to re-emphasize again the extreme savagery, the existential nature of the conflict that the Soviet people fought during the Second World War. And of course, it brings it up to date with the conflict that Putin and the Russian government say is being fought in Ukraine now. And over the course of these comments, Putin made this statement. This is a statement, this is in comments he made during his visit to this memorial to all the people who had died, the civilians who had died in the Soviet Union during the Second World War. It is important for us today and for the future. We are witnessing a disturbing trend where the outcomes of the Nuremberg trials, which unequivocally condemn Nazism, are being revised. Some countries not only rewrite history and exonerate the executioners, revanchists and neo-Nazis have embraced the Nazi ideology and methods. We will do all we can to eradicate Nazism. The followers of Nazi executioners, no matter what they call themselves today, are doomed. The Kiev regime glorifies the followers and members of the SS and uses terror against dissenters. Barbaric shelling of peaceful cities and towns persist, and the killing of the elderly, women and children continues. Some European countries endorse Russophobia as a state policy. So he's bringing the events of the Second World War and the events in Ukraine together. He's connecting them. He says that the war in Ukraine, the conflict in Ukraine, is a continuation of the same struggle. He also, by the way, has some very critical things to say about the Baltic states. He says that tens of thousands of people, and it's not difficult to work out which people, he means Russian or Russian-speaking people in the Baltic states, are labeled subhumans, stripped of basic rights and persecuted. Again, except, of course, that the governments of the Baltic states would deny that, as would have Western officials and commentators. I'm not going to discuss this issue today in this program. But anyway, this is what Putin is saying. And he's basically telling the Russians, the Russian people, and not just the Russian people, but the world, that this conflict that is going on in Ukraine is a continuation, in effect, of the conflict that took place during the Second World War. The same forces and the same ideologies are at play. Russia is on the right side, just as it was in the Second World War. Some European states are on the wrong side. And when he talks about former members of the SS and people like that being celebrated today, and some countries not only rewrite history and exonerate the executioners. It's not difficult to imagine that he's alluding, at least in part, to recent events in the Canadian Parliament, which I'm not going to discuss further. But of course, he's also talking about a general trend in the West to basically deny the Soviet Union's role in the Second World War and to try to downplay, or rather to equate today's Russia with the fascist regimes of the past, and to equate the Soviet Union with the Germany of that period as well. So this is all very powerful and very strong language from Putin, language which is going to have major traction amongst many Russians. And of course, he's been, in a kind of a way, assisted in this by some incredibly insensitive and strange comments from the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who I understand, I haven't seen the comments themselves, I don't want to see the comments, apparently spoke about Auschwitz having been liberated by Allied forces. She said Allied forces. Apparently she refused to mention the Red Army or the Russians, who were, of course, the people who actually liberated Auschwitz. And again, one can't help but see that this is what Putin would say, that this is an example of the rewriting of history that he is complaining so much about, and which Russians, of course, find so profoundly offensive. And when Putin talks about some countries endorsing Russophobia as a state policy, well, Putin and other Russian officials can point to these comments of Ursula von der Leyen, and one can see what they mean. But I think I would like to make a further point here about all of these words, because if Putin is indeed making this linkage, and in this exceptionally public way, going to these monuments to civilians who've died during the Second World War as a result of the actions of the Germans, of the Nazis during the Second World War. If he's making these comments and he's drawing these parallels with Ukraine today, if he's talking about attacks on civilians then and attacks on civilians now, barbaric shelling of peaceful cities and towns, and killing the elderly, women and children. And again, it's not difficult to see this as connecting the events of the Second World War with the events of today, the attacks on Donetsk and Belgorod. Well, if he's making this kind of linkage, how can he stop simply at, well, the Dnieper or after liberating Donbass or something like that? These comments point clearly, or so they seem to me, to Putin seeking nothing less than the complete eradication of the government in Kiev, which he is, in effect, saying is the inheritor of the traditions that the Soviet people fought, of the traditions of the movement and the countries, the fascist countries, that the Soviet people fought in the Second World War. And he actually says as much. He says, we will do all we can to halt and eradicate Nazism. The followers of Nazi executioners, no matter what they call themselves today, are doomed. Nothing can deter the desire of millions of people in Russia and across the planet for true freedom, justice, peace, and security. So, these are obviously elliptical comments still, in some respects, but they make it abundantly clear to me that from Putin's perspective, it's not any longer just a case of liberating and securing Donbass, keeping Ukraine out of NATO, or doing that kind of thing. It is of defeating the present political system, Ukraine completely, and dismantling its entire political system, its government as well. And note the reference to the Nuremberg trials, note the comment about the desire of millions of people in Russia and across the planet for true freedom, justice. Justice is being given as much weight as freedom, peace, and security, which suggests that he's basically looking also for an accounting with, according to account of the people who he appears to see in Ukraine as the inheritors of the ideology that was driving the Germans in the 1930s and 1940s. So I think all of these comments of Putin's, the way he's linking everything together, and he's doing so very intentionally now, point very clearly to a desire from this point onwards to see a final and conclusive end to the Ukraine that President Zelensky presides over. I'm not saying Ukraine as a state. Perhaps if there is a final military collapse, the Russians will step back, understand that some kind of Ukrainian state needs to be preserved, even if only in their own interests, Russia's interests. But they will certainly not tolerate the kind of Ukraine that exists now. And it seems to me that certain statements by Sergei Lavrov that he's been making over the last couple of days, as he has been attending meetings in New York and other places, as he's been giving interviews, point the same way. Lavrov has been saying that it's not Russia's business to try to find ways to preserve in power the current government in Kiev, which, it seems to me, is pretty close to points that he has made previously, which is that the conflict cannot end whilst the current government in Kiev remains in place. And we've now had some more words, this time from a Russian diplomat, Alexei Polishchuk, who is the head of the second department of CIS countries at the Russian Foreign Ministry. He says the current Kiev leadership are puppets, first of all, of Washington, London, and Brussels. They benefit from escalating the Ukrainian crisis, which they are using not only to try to accomplish the goal of inflicting a strategic defeat to Russia, but also to implement measures that are aimed at weakening the economies of their competitors from continental Europe, who have been zombified by the Russian threat and do not realize the real threats to their security. On its part, Russia has always remained open to truly substantive proposals on how to overcome the current crisis through political and diplomatic methods. Well, these comments from this Russian diplomat I mean, what they're basically saying is, look, the people in Kiev don't really matter. They're only puppets of Washington, London, and Brussels. Let's sweep them away. I mean, that seems to me to be the implication. And let's come to a deal. But of course, it has to be a deal based on the actual realities: no NATO membership, recognition of Russian territories as Russian territories, what the Russians say are Russian territories, and the end, a new security architecture for Europe. And of course, we have to get rid of these people in Kiev because they have no real interest in ending the war, because all they're basically there for is in order to continue it. That there is no hope now that the West will change its approach to the Ukrainian settlement. The current Kiev in leadership are puppets, and Washington, London, and Brussels benefit from escalating the Ukrainian crisis. So I have to say that one way or the other, it's now clear to me that we are definitely now moving towards an announced Russian policy, probably sometime when the Russians do finally get to the gates of Kiev, maybe this summer, maybe next year, when they do finally say the war is going to end, and it's going to end on our terms, and we will see finally and fully the end of this government in Kiev, and that's our objective. Now, I don't say that Putin has completely closed off his options. He's still not openly said that Russia's objectives are to extinguish Ukraine as a state. He's not openly said that regime change in Kiev is his objective. He probably realizes that in terms of diplomacy, doing that would not go down well with many of his allies and friends. But my own view is when I read comments like the ones that Putin has made over the course of his visit to St. Petersburg, I feel that emotionally and psychologically, he's now crossed the line. I don't think that there is any conceivable way back, given what he has said, given his feelings, his undoubtedly sincere feelings about what happened during the Second World War, in which, by the way, his father fought and was severely wounded. And of course, always remember that Leningrad, St. Petersburg, where this terrible siege took place, is his own home city. And he will have been brought up by people all around him who spoke continuously about it. And as he's pointed out himself, he lost a brother who died before he was born. I understand as a result of the war. I might be wrong about that. But anyway, I don't see how Putin, if he feels himself this way about the current government in Ukraine, can allow himself in the end to come to a deal with it. I mean, it would be so completely contrary to the position that he's laid out here that I think it would be a massive emotional and psychological wrench for him to do that. Anyway, that's what I'm saying. I think that probably the door for negotiations is now practically shut. The West, anyway, has shown no ability to put together a plan for negotiations. And I think these words from Putin basically tell us that, emotionally speaking, he's crossed the Rubicon and he will now move on until final victory in Ukraine is achieved. That's my assessment, at least, of his words. Now, this is where I finish today my program about Ukraine, but I will say a few more things about the situation in the Middle East. Firstly, it is absolutely clear that the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel is not going to comply in any way with the decisions of the International Court of Justice in The Hague. For a complete analysis, a detailed analysis of what happened in that hearing, I would suggest that you look to a program in which I was privileged to participate, hosted by Consortium News, in which we were fortunate enough to be joined by people like Ray McGovern, veterans intelligence professionals for Sanity, Ambassador Craig Murray from Britain, and also Francis Boyle, who is a lawyer who has argued genocide cases before the ICJ in the past on several occasions and obtained orders from the ICJ. And I think his analysis, Francis Boyle's analysis on the legal issues, is definitive. It confirms the view that I have already expressed, that the decision by the ICJ was the strongest that could possibly have been made. And Francis Boyle explains to some extent some of the reasons for that decision. And he confirms also that in the event that the Security Council now fails to take action, in the event of Israel's non-compliance, there is now scope for the General Assembly to take action in the Security Council's place. Notwithstanding all of that, it's clear to me that Israel is intending to defy the decision of the International Court of Justice. And in the meantime, all the indicators now point strongly to another war by Israel against Hezbollah in Lebanon. There's talk apparently that unless Hezbollah agrees to withdraw from territory on the border with Israel, then Israel will launch attacks on southern Lebanon and try to force Hezbollah back to the Litani River. And over the last couple of hours, there's been multiple reports about massive bombing of southern Lebanon by the Israeli Air Force. Now, I find all of this utterly dismaying. It's becoming increasingly clear to me that the United States has lost control of its Israeli ally. This is my own view. I know some people, on the contrary, think that the United States is urging on its Israeli ally. And I suspect that there are some people in Washington who are, of course, doing precisely that. But any calculation that must exist in Washington that a de-escalation is not what is needed, that is going to go out of the window if, on top of the fighting with the Houthis in Yemen, Israel now attacks Hezbollah. We will get one huge step closer to that point when an attack on Iran takes place. It's astonishing to see how rudderless, in the face of these multiple crises, this administration is now becoming. And I would add, by the way, the same is true of the crisis within the United States. In my opinion, the crisis over the Texas border should never have been allowed to happen at all. Look, instead of making applications to the Supreme Court of the United States, the Biden administration would have been much better advised to call in Governor Abbott, have him come to the White House, meet the president, discuss with Governor Abbott what he needed, come to an agreement with him. And that would have been the obvious thing to do, is what, say, Ronald Reagan or Bill Clinton would have done. Well, as we know, that wasn't done. Instead, the administration went to the Supreme Court, which made the situation worse by giving the administration what it wanted, a decision in its favor, and a decision which, however, Texas is busy defying, with more and more of the Republican states piling up behind it, and with public opinion in the United States on its side. And again, the way forward was obvious: call in Governor Abbott, have a further discussion, come to some kind of agreement, which you could call a compromise. Nothing like that was done, and instead we have a drift. There's reports that the administration has now stepped back from taking steps to enforce its actions on the border, but there's been no announcement to that effect, and certainly no public agreement with Governor Abbott. So the overall effect of this is going to make the administration look weak. This is now the pattern. The administration is no longer controlling events. It is controlled by them. It reminds me very much, I should say, of the situation globally in the last year of the Carter administration in 1980, 1981, when again the administration was basically reacting to events rather than controlling them. My opinion is that the administration took the decisions, found that it had lost the initiative when it became clear that the Ukrainian offensive, upon which it had staked its authority, had been defeated in the summer. Since then, it has had no real plan about what to do and no real ability to come up with a plan. It has instead done something which must be sending the chancelleries of Europe into a state of deep crisis. In an act of what I can only see as retaliatory measure against Texas, they banned LNG exports from the United States, apparently disregarding the fact that having strong-armed the Europeans into giving up on imports of gas from Russia, the Europeans are now entirely dependent on imports of LNG gas from the United States. So what are the Europeans going to do? Well, they've already closed down much of their industry because they're not getting cheap Russian gas anymore. They will either have to continue to close even more of their industry if they don't get expensive American gas, or much more likely, they're going to turn to the Russians and step up imports of cheap LNG gas from Russia. I mean, it's chaos at the center of power, which is, of course, becoming more obvious and more dangerous by the day. Well, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work by going to Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. You can see that, all the amazing things that we have there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Apologies again for the croaky voice. It is getting better by the hour, but having said that, it's a slow process. In other respects, by the way, I should say I feel rested and well. But anyway, I will get there very soon. And thank you again for joining me today, and have a very good day.